I'm going to tell you now that I absolutely love this update. I'm also very biased. Let's get into it. Well, for the first part of this review, I'll be avoiding major spoilers for this quest and faction. Be aware that there will, inevitably, be spoilers for the quest prior to this one. I would also like to note that I started playing a few days after launch, so a lot of issues were hotfixed out before I got to them, while others remain unresolved. Bear in mind that because this game is perpetually in development, certain criticisms will be lesser or irrelevant in future. Right off the bat, this quest environments are so well done. The tile set works to make a seeming maze of a city, with seasonal changes and all sorts of details throughout. I love how the presence of both the tech rot and Skuldra can be felt throughout the city, even when the enemies aren't present. The grungy dystopia is apparent at all times and contrasts and fits perfectly with the 90s setting, a setting that is lovingly crafted right down to the little never share your personal information online message in the chat UI with characters. Admittedly, this isn't a setting I personally experience much, being an early noughties baby, with how fast trends and tech move on, but the vibes are on point regardless. The mall manages to feel like a proper lived-in but makeshift space, and significantly more homey than the streets outside. I'm amazed by just how much work was put into fleshing the place out. Alongside everything else, there's also an arcade game included as an entire extra thing inside the mall. I've only played a bit of it, but it's a fun side-scrolling shooter. At no point did they have to add this, but these details and extras just give more reason to look around the place a bit more. This update does a very good job of establishing its characters from the start. Each has a distinct and nuanced personality and backstory, even if it can take a bit to get into it. Their personalities shine through their character designs, animations and voice acting alike, which all act to enhance the writing. Mission dialogue is just as full of character as everywhere else, and I very much like seeing characters interact over the comms while you progress in a mission, although I wish they did it a bit more. Speaking of establishing stuff early on, the premise is effectively conveyed from the start, and the quest has some effective foreshadowing throughout. Its themes are consistent, not only internally but also with regards to previous quests, mostly. I had the odd bit I wasn't a fan of, but overall, by god, this story can really hit hard. Really helped by the brilliant voice acting and soundtrack. The Warframe soundtrack is extremely solid across the board, and they brought out all the stops for this update. A nice variety of styles, all period appropriate, and all going on my playlist. A bit of an aside, but while online aren't really in the game at time of writing, instead being introduced in a part 2 of the expansion, their presence and backstory are a real blast so far, and I'm begging DE to please bless us with more songs from them. I can't say too much on the combat or movement since it's essentially standard Warframe fare, so plays smoothly and fun. I didn't find most of the update particularly difficult, but that's what Steel Path's for, and by god they deliver on the difficulty department with an absurdly difficult optional boss. I have yet to beat it, I don't know if I'm even good enough at the game to beat it, but I will solo it one day for the special glyphs. The quest gameplay largely acts as a means to introduce you to the mission types you'll be playing from there on out, as you work your way up with a new faction. While this quest, like others prior, has quick-time events, they're very manageable, and don't require absurdly fast tapping, or really any tapping, since you can change repeated inputs from tap to hold in the accessibility settings. But enough about the main story and combat. We're all here for the visual novel elements, and they're really well written, but weren't implemented perfectly. If, like me, you get your chemistry up with the characters quickly, you miss out on a chunk of the instant messenger chats. For some reason, chats are restricted to a single chemistry level, so the moment you rank up, you lose access to any remaining chats from the previous rank. This is made worse by the fact that you can only get one chat after max rank, being left with silence from your best friends. DE are aware of the issue and have said they'll sort it out after the holidays. But in the meantime, I think I'm going to reset my relationships in the next loop to experience the chats I missed out on the first time round, taking it much slower. This issue aside, the chats themselves are brilliantly written and showcase not only the Hexes' characters and backstories, but also the Drifters. With the varied cast, any given player is pretty much guaranteed to gel with at least one of them. I've had an absolute joy logging in daily to check on the new chats, and I'm aghast at not getting any more. They're also painfully realistic in that all of us keep fumbling them. I have 3 pieces of advice to give for the chats, and those are 1. Don't be a dick. 2. Don't be a dick. And 3, stop telling Arthur what you want to do to his sister, he does not want to hear about it. In all seriousness, I appreciate how the characters behave as distinct people, so you have to learn to navigate their personalities and boundaries in order to get to know them properly. And you need to get to know them in order to properly interact with them, in a loop of understanding and care. It works thematically and showcases the amount of thought and care put into the writing. It does also result in players fumbling their interactions because they didn't know something at the time. Thankfully for any fumblers, you can't lose chemistry in the chats, even if some of you all really should. That's not to say there's a complete lack of consequences, since characters can call you out, and you can get dumped by and blacklisted from being able to date characters if you're an arsehole, which you can reset with a new loop, alongside all other relationship stuff. With all this comes the issue that this is a bit of a content island right now. I'm sure it might very well change when the next update comes out, but it feels disconnected from the rest of the game, especially with how resources are only available and used in this part of the game. It's fundamentally the same issue with most factions, where once you max them out, unless they provide a service like Incarnon weapons, you're not heading back there, except for Nightwave and events. And last but not least for the spoiler-free section, since this is Warframe, expect a few bugs every so often. I encountered a few soft logging bugs, one of which required me to Alt F4 out of the game, but nothing I hadn't already encountered in the game prior. Compared to the release of Angels of Azaraman and Railjack, the few bugs I did see were pretty minor and mostly resolved while unstuck. I appreciate how the bug of the Atomocycle being able to be used everywhere has become a feature, even if you can't use it in open space anymore. I'm kinda mad I didn't try that before it was patched out, but I can still appreciate the novelty and great response from the dev team. It pains me that I can't really recommend this update to non-Warframe player friends, given the vast amount of time it takes to get to, but I love and recommend it all the same. Now, let's get into spoilers. If you haven't played the quest yet, leave and come back when you've got the proper ending. You will know it when you see it, assuming you want to go in semi-blind, which is what I would recommend. I will also be touching on a detail from a character's backstory revealed in the instant messenger chats, so bear that in mind as well. Of course, I have to talk about that ending, and this is your last chance to click off before major spoilers. That initial bad ending was brutal, to say the least. There's a lot I could talk about, with how it emotionally devastates a player by showing the characters die one by one, while not giving them the opportunity to save them in that loop. But I think the best place to start is the main point that it was extremely effective at getting me invested in getting to know and help them. From here on out, this will be a bit of a ramble, less review and more analysis. I have so much to say regarding the endings with regards to each character, so I'll go in order of death for some sort of structure. Letty and Eleanor's fates are intertwined no matter the timeline, and this comes down to their feelings for one another. Letty tries to compartmentalize and keep herself detached from Eleanor, considering her a monster not just because of her mutations, but also her own suppressed feelings and fears surrounding her. And when it comes down to it, she can't pull the trigger in her attempt to reach out is too little too late. While Eleanor is lost in loneliness and self-loathing and swallowed whole by the infestation, she dies not by physical means, but by the destruction of herself. At the end of it all, they're both doomed by their emotional distance. But when Eleanor rips her tongue out, escaping the grasp of the infestation and bringing herself out of that downward spiral, their smiles say more than any words possibly could. And when we see them in the ending diorama, they're close, they're caring, and while they still have plenty of room to heal, they're safe. I love this sort of dynamic so much. By comparison, Quincy's death is almost understated. He gets shot by a tank quick and total, but what hurts me the most is his acceptance. It's a stark contrast to his time pre-infestation, where he abandoned his post to save his own skin. He's willing to see it through if it means actually following through on what he feels he owes Arthur from way back then. His life. He's loyal to a fault, and what saves him isn't any sort of change of heart, it's accepting help and resolving to move on. Aoi's an interesting one in that she's saved largely just by being reminded of her own worth. She's brought out of her fearful focus, giving her a reminder to rethink her technique and resolve the issue without overly straining herself, instead of beating her head against a proverbial brick wall until it implodes. Emir the same is trapped in a spiral of fear and self-doubt. His panic attack really hit home, especially with how he beats himself up for his perceived failures. It tracks with his larger feelings of inadequacy, being the odd one out and unused to combat situations. But when he gets his helping hand, gets the tools needed to get the job done, he's able to handle things himself no problem. Both of them are competent, scarily so, but their tunnel vision and self-doubt get in the way. And Arthur, he needs to learn to lean on others. Like Quincy, he's willing to sacrifice himself for those he loves, even if it destroys him. He holds the weight of the world on his shoulders. It's only once he's willing to accept help that he can survive. And that's the message of this story. That we need to care for each other and prop each other up. As you interact with them more, you can help them sort out their personal and interpersonal issues alike. Like with Amir talking to Arthur and Quincy about his nightmares and getting support from them. The same applies to Drifter. It's only through helping others and opening up their heart to them that they can address their own demons. They have a lot in common with all of the Hex. Their loneliness, their outsider status, their insecurity, their loyalty, and the desire to help others, and fear of losing them. The dialogue reveals just as much about the character you play as it does any of the Hex. They're a self-insert, yes, but they've also got a surprisingly large amount of depth in and of themselves. I'm not a big fan of the Drifter's murmur combat encounters between helping characters, but I may just be impatient. I entirely recognise the narrative purpose they serve as a means to show the Drifter having to actively fight their way through to the Hex, and the Indifference's resistance to them doing so, even if they did feel like padding. And speaking of the Drifter's actions, I love how they're taking control of the loop in Deviri, comes back with them banging their fist like Dominus Thrax before them to start again. But this time it's different. Now they're not just saving themselves, but others, who they barely even know at that point. It speaks to how their character has grown, while also holding on to their past as an important part of them. Of course, an analysis of the cast would be incomplete without a good villain. We never really get to see the real Rusalka, and I hope DE bring her back at some point, but we do see of what became of her is wonderfully done. The twist of Rusalka being possessed by the man in the wall is well done in my opinion, with foreshadowing in her dialogue only a few minutes into the quest. The scene of her trying to torment Entrati is brilliantly theatrical and full of style. Speaking of which, Entrati was great too, such a catty old man, and how he braced himself upon feeling Lloyd's touch, knowing it wasn't real, delicious. How he laughed in the face of an eldritch god, confessing to it its weakness. Oh, I find him a delectable character. A manipulative bastard of a man who leaves a trail of destruction and victims in his wake, while still being oddly endearing in a way I can't quite put my finger on. Again, in the villain department, I find Victor to be a great antagonist. He's got a weird religious zealotry thing going on alongside his massive ego. He's so unbelievably punchable, and I love him. I'm going to give an extra spoiler warning here for the max rank with the Hex, so leave now if you want it to be a surprise. All good? Alright. I was initially going to complain about how characters mention civilians in interactions with them, but you, as a player, don't get to see them. However, upon reaching max rank with the Hex, they invite civilians in. They all, or at least mostly, seem to be blokes though in my game for some reason. I'm not sure if this is a bug or just a lack of model variety, the latter being the option I suspect the most. With all that said, what are your opinions on this update? Please keep major spoilers out of the comments, or at least behind read more with a warning. Thank you for watching, and a late Happy New Year.